Masters of the Universe is doomed to fail. More than just a cartoon or a Mattel toy, He-Man is a childhood treasure for a lot of people. But his jump to the big screen has been marked by total disaster. He-Man might be able to face off against Skeletor and his henchmen, but he's never been able to beat the curse that haunts his movie adaptations. If you think we're exaggerating, just look at the track record. Box office bombs, sequels canceled at the last minute, and countless projects that never even got off the ground. In fact, these days, the character stays relevant more because of viral internet parodies than his actual story. But what exactly is going wrong? Why did bringing Eternia to theaters turn into such torture? And the question I have for you is, can this new adaptation of Masters of the Universe finally break the curse with the Power Sword? To understand why this new movie could be yet another disaster, we have to go back in time and look at the previous attempts. Get ready for a story plagued by bad decisions, a complete lack of direction, millions of dollars down the drain, an actor who trained for absolutely nothing for years, and lots of memes. Long before adapting cartoons was a guaranteed hit, Masters of the Universe had a movie that built up massive hype, but it all ended in disaster. At first, success seemed like a sure thing. The animated series, produced by Filmation, had been on the air since 1983 and completely hooked kids everywhere. Children ran around playing He-Man and repeating his famous catchphrases. The toys were flying off the shelves. With a phenomenon like that, how could they not make a movie? Actually, there was an initial attempt with The Secret of the Sword in 1985, which was really just 3 episodes stitched together. Even so, it cost $2 million and grossed $7 million. A modest success, but enough for Mattel to take things to the next level, a live-action movie. The toy company could have partnered with massive Hollywood studios, but they ended up teaming up with Canon Films, an independent company known for churning out low-budget action movies. Its owners were Menahem Golan and Yoram Globus, 2 Israeli cousins who wanted to raise the stakes with expensive productions and big stars. They saw Masters of the Universe as their chance to make the ultimate leap and get their very own Star Wars, which was basically every studio's obsession in the 80s. But the problem started almost immediately. Canon set a budget of $22 million, with Mattel chipping in part of the money. It was a generous amount for the mid-80s, but it still wasn't enough to pull off everything the script called for. Originally, the story took place in Eternia, just like the show, and featured He-Man's classic allies, Battle Cat and Orko, the floating wizard. To save money, they decided to cut the tiger entirely and replace Orko with Gwildor, an inventor who ends up transporting He-Man and his crew to a modern-day town in the United States. The production also couldn't land any big stars. The role of He-Man went to Dolph Lundgren, the Swedish actor who had just immortalized Ivan Drago in Rocky IV. Skeletor went to Frank Langella, a character actor who took the part simply because his son was a huge fan of the show. The director was Gary Goddard, a Universal theme park designer who had never actually worked on a movie before. The outlook for Masters of the Universe was already sketchy, and the filming turned into absolute chaos. Mattel took creative control of the movie, forcing decisions that impacted entire sequences. For instance, they banned He-Man from killing his enemies or acting too aggressive. To get around this, a lot of the bad guys were turned into robots. There were also arguments over the character design and the overall tone of the film. In fact, it never really figured out if it wanted to be a kid's adventure or a more mature fantasy, an identity crisis that ended up haunting future attempts at adapting the franchise. On top of all that, there were financial issues. Canon was struggling and Mattel didn't always make their payments. Tensions escalated to the point of causing strikes on set. Goddard was desperate, especially since he wasn't allowed to shoot the epic final showdown between He-Man and Skeletor. He actually had to use his own money to shoot a smaller-scale fight with Lundgren and Langella. Any other problems? Oh yeah, Goddard always hated Lundgren's heavy Swedish accent. He wanted to dub his voice in post-production, but because of his contract, he couldn't. Meanwhile, Lundgren was getting totally fed up with the director and the working conditions. And the issues didn't stop there. Halfway through production, Mattel noticed that Masters of the Universe toy sales were dropping, so they basically stopped caring about the movie. Suddenly, no one was really in control of the project. Under those terrible conditions, Masters of the Universe hit theaters in 1987 and completely bombed. Critics tore it apart, and audiences just ignored it. It grossed $17 million, and remember, it cost $22 million to make. As a result, Lundgren never landed a leading role that big again, and Goddard never directed another movie. But the damage went even further. He-Man, the ultimate childhood idol, became forever linked to a massive failure, setting a precedent for his terrible luck at the movies. Despite the awful box office performance of Masters of the Universe, Cannon actually wanted to make a sequel. But what happened next is so bizarre that it deserves its own chapter. If you thought the Masters of the Universe experience was a fever dream, wait until you hear what happened with the sequel that never saw the light of day. Golan and Globus were confident a sequel would do better, but they wanted to make a movie that was less kiddie and a lot darker, and above all, cheaper. To pull that off, they brought in Albert Pyun, a director used to working fast and on a shoestring budget. He promised to make the movie for just $4.5 million, and he didn't stop there. He also convinced the executives that he could shoot another ambitious project for the studio at the exact same time, a Spider-Man adaptation. The director's plan was as bizarre as it was ambitious. First, he would spend 2 weeks filming the opening scenes for Spider-Man, then he'd pivot to spend 6 weeks on Masters of the Universe 2, and finally, he'd jump back into the web-slinger's story to finish the action sequences, giving the actor time to train physically between shoots. Surprisingly enough, Cannon actually greenlit this idea. Soon, sets and costumes for Masters of the Universe 2 started being built in Wilmington, North Carolina. The production reached out to Lundgren to reprise his role, but he turned it down flat. He had no interest in putting himself through another miserable experience. Instead, the production cast Laird Hamilton, a model and surfer with zero acting experience. Everything seemed to be moving forward, but just 2 weeks before cameras were set to roll, the whole project collapsed. Cannon lost the licensing rights from both Marvel and Mattel, meaning Golan and Globus couldn't move forward. They were on the verge of bankruptcy. As a result, production on both Spider-Man and Masters of the Universe 2 was completely shut down. And for the latter, they had already sunk about $2 million into it. That was the end of the road for He-Man and Cannon, but this story has an unexpected twist. Not wanting the sets and costumes to go to waste, Pyun wrote an entirely new script over a single weekend, asked for $500,000, and made a completely different movie, Cyborg, starring Jean-Claude Van Damme. And hey, at least that one was a hit. After a disastrous first movie and a sequel that never even got filmed, bringing Masters of the Universe to the big screen seemed impossible. Even so, Hollywood refused to give up, and they'd keep trying for decades. Let's jump to the year 2000. He-Man had conquered television and the toy industry, but not the movies. The new century promised to change that story, even though every single attempt failed. The project fell into what Hollywood calls development hell. At the start of the decade, Mattel decided to give Hollywood another shot. This time around, they were only going to bet on major studios to avoid the mistakes of the past. The timing was perfect. Fantasy and superhero movies were dominating the box office. He-Man had a better chance than ever. The promises started in 2004 when Mattel struck a deal with Fox 2000, a subsidiary of 20th Century Fox. Fans were absolutely thrilled when the director was announced. Hong Kong filmmaker John Woo, who was coming off massive hits like Face Off and Mission Impossible 2. In fact, he was also set to produce the film through his company, Lion Rock Productions. Fox 2000 also brought on screenwriter Adam Rifkin, a huge fan of the show, who wrote a draft titled He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. Rumors only fueled the hype. Paul Walker was being considered for He-Man, and Nicolas Cage was supposedly in talks for Skeletor. Everything pointed to an ambitious blockbuster that would finally do the character justice. But the project didn't pan out. Wu wanted to leave his signature mark, focusing on dazzling action choreography and a more epic, mature tone for Eternia. Fox 2000, on the other hand, wanted something much more mainstream and a lot less expensive. These creative differences led Rifkin to write several drafts, but none of them won over the director or the studio executives. After 2 years of back and forth, the studio canceled the project and the rights went back to Mattel. It seemed like a huge missed opportunity for Masters of the Universe, but in 2007, a new hope emerged. Warner Brothers acquired the rights and handed the project over to Joel Silver, the producer behind the Die Hard, Lethal Weapon, and the Matrix franchises. The script was assigned to Justin Marks, who soon had a draft ready titled Grayskull: The Masters of the Universe. Meanwhile, Silver in the studio brought on John Stevenson to direct, who had just come off directing Kung Fu Panda. The tone they were going for was a mix of grit and spectacle, similar to Zack Snyder's 300. In Grayskull, Adam is a soldier searching for his destiny who ends up discovering Eternia. There, he faces off against Skeletor, who is now the leader of a high-tech army hell-bent on wiping out magic. It was a modern take, aimed at a young adult audience. No one doubted that the Grayskull project was moving forward. Plus, it was the perfect time for the movie. Hollywood was busy churning out adaptations of toy franchises and cartoons like Transformers and G.I. Joe. Everything pointed to He-Man, his allies, and his enemies finally getting their redemption on the big screen. But it all fell apart. Silver, Warner Brothers, and Stevenson were happy with Mark's script, but Mattel was furious. Their main goal was to sell toys, so they wanted a movie geared toward kids. To soften the tone, they had to bring in another screenwriter, Evan Doherty. Even so, neither the filmmakers nor the toy company could get on the same page and agree on a shared vision. Finally, in 2009, Warner and Silver let the Masters of the Universe license go. At that point, Masters of the Universe seemed like an impossible franchise to adapt. Every attempt ended the exact same way, caught between clashing visions and contradicting decisions. However, in September 2009, Sony Pictures stepped in to scoop up the rights. The promises flared up again, but as you'll soon see, the curse wouldn't spare the studio behind the smash hit Spider-Man movies either. Sony poured a ton of energy into the project, but ended up facing more problems than ever. The studio first brought in screenwriters Alex Litvak and Mike Finch to write a draft from scratch, completely ignoring the material developed at Warner Brothers. They put together an epic space adventure story. The chosen director was John M. Chu, who had just come off working on G.I. Joe Retaliation. He envisioned an origin story with a military vibe, so he brought in another writer, Richard Wenk. This adaptation of Masters of the Universe was going well, until Chu stepped down in 2013 and the project was put on hold. Far from giving up, Sony brought in another screenwriter, the experienced Terry Rossio, and went looking for a new director. They considered names like Rian Johnson, Phil Lord, and Christopher Miller, and even Argentine filmmaker Andy Muschietti. They ultimately went with Jeff Wadlow, who had just directed Kick-Ass 2. He rewrote the script and kicked off pre-production, but the same old problems popped up. The budget was way too high, and Mattel felt the tone was way too dark. Masters of the Universe was left in limbo, but Sony was dead set on making this movie. In 2015, they called in another writer, Christopher Yost, who had worked on Thor: The Dark World. In fact, the studio tasked him with writing a Marvel-level adventure story. That's why they brought in a director who fit that exact vision, MCG, best known for the Charlie's Angels movies. He loved the idea of making a blockbuster that was emotional but still fun, and he soon met with a potential candidate to play He-Man, Kellen Lutz, one of the vampires from the Twilight Saga. This time, Mattel was on board, and in 2017, they announced a release date, December 18, 2019. Nothing seemed to be stopping this adaptation, but shortly after, MCG dropped out and all those plans vanished. Despite an endless list of setbacks, Sony insisted on getting Masters of the Universe made. This time, they hired David S. Goyer, the writer behind the Dark Knight trilogy. His ambition was very specific, an epic fantasy on the level of The Lord of the Rings. Both the studio and Mattel were thrilled with his pitch, and he started working on the conceptual design for Eternia. But the excitement didn't last long. The estimated budget was hovering around $250 million, a number Sony wasn't willing to risk on a franchise with such a poor track record at the movies. The project was put on hold once again, and Goyer had no choice but to walk away. It was pretty clear that Masters of the Universe had become a tough problem to solve. Even so, Sony made one last attempt. They hired brothers Aaron and Adam Nee, who came up through indie cinema. The studio asked them for a fun story, but one that wouldn't cost more than $150 million. They fully committed to the project, to the point where they even wrote their own script. When a lot of people were starting to doubt these directors, the actor chosen to play He-Man was announced in 2019, rising star Noah Centineo. The casting sparked a lot of doubts among fans, who just couldn't see him pulling off He-Man's massive physique. None of that bothered Sony or the directors, though. Undaunted, Noah went on a strict diet. He had to eat 11 eggs every day just for breakfast, and trained at a boxing gym. The new definitive Masters of the Universe movie was finally heading into production, with its sights set on a March 2021 release. But it all fell apart again. The executives at Sony still had doubts about the project, viewing it as a massive financial risk. To make matters worse, the pandemic hit in 2020 and completely shut down the industry. Nobody could figure out how to balance the budget, and the production got stuck in an endless pre-production loop. This whole dynamic really frustrated Noah. He was eating 6,000 calories a day and training non-stop to get that He-Man physique, but filming never actually started. In April 2021, after 2 years of pointless preparation, the actor walked away from the movie. The delays also wore Sony out. After so many failed attempts, they sold the rights to recoup some of their investment and dodge a potential box office bomb. In January 2022, the press announced that Masters of the Universe had been acquired by Netflix, but instead of being the solution, it just turned into another nightmare. The definitive Masters of the Universe movie had found a home at the streaming giant, at least for a while. Unlike previous attempts, the project wasn't starting from scratch. Netflix had acquired the Nee Brothers development package. The budget was set at $200 million, making it one of the company's most expensive movies ever. David Callahan was brought in to polish the script, and the executives loved the material. Concept art was quickly commissioned to move forward with pre-production. At the same time, the directors went looking for a new He-Man. They chose Kyle Allen, a rising Hollywood star who also divided the fan base. Since he was pretty slim, a lot of people thought he'd be believable as Prince Adam, but definitely not as He-Man. The chances for Masters of the Universe on Netflix looked promising, since the studio was betting heavily on that mythology. In 2021, they released the animated series Masters of the Universe Revelation, created by Kevin Smith, which acted as a mature sequel to the 80s show. Then they put out He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, a CG animated series aimed at a younger audience. It was clear that He-Man had become a flagship property for the Big Red Ant. Now, all that was missing was the movie. And then it all fell apart again. In mid-2023, Netflix went through a financial crisis due to a drop in subscribers. Because of that, they didn't want to risk $200 million on any single project. Facing that reality, the Nee brothers tried to save the movie by cutting the budget down to $180 million. They also pitched a sequel back-to-back to lower overall costs, but nothing convinced the executives. And there were other factors at play. For one, they didn't think Kyle Allen could carry a massive blockbuster. On top of that, Hollywood was right in the middle of the SAG-AFTRA strike, which shut down countless projects. Plus, there was another issue. The He-Man shows were doing well, but they hadn't exactly turned into a cultural phenomenon like Stranger Things. In July 2023, Netflix officially canceled Masters of the Universe. By that point, they had already spent $30 million developing the project, though some sources claim the number was actually double that. At this point, a lot of people figured the adaptation was cursed and would never see the light of day. But Mattel didn't give up. They shopped the rights around to other studios until they landed at Amazon MGM Studios. Could this finally be the end of the losing streak? After 2 decades of frustration, the Masters of the Universe movie would finally start to take shape, though not without some new hurdles. When Netflix canceled the production, the Nee brothers stepped away from the project. Even so, Amazon decided to push forward. They kept the script developed with David Callahan, strengthened their partnership with Mattel, and went looking for a new creative team. To direct, they brought in Travis Knight, best known for Kubo and the Two Strings and Bumblebee. For both the executives and the fans, it was a promising choice. He came from the world of animation and had a style that blended big spectacle with real heart. Knight was also able to bring in his frequent collaborator, Chris Butler, to rewrite parts of the script. Production moved forward with so much momentum that they quickly locked in a release date, June 5, 2026. The next step was finding someone capable of playing Prince Adam and He-Man. They went with Nicholas Galitzine, a young British actor and singer. Just like with Centineo and Allen, the fan reaction was mixed, or honestly, pretty hostile. No one saw his casting coming, and they just couldn't picture him as the beloved hero. The rest of the fandom, feeling pretty cynical after years of failures, just assumed the project would get shelved again. However, unlike all those other times, the rest of the cast was announced shortly after. Every new name drummed up more interest in the movie, until the announcement that Skeletor would be played by Jared Leto. He's a charismatic, award-winning star, but the internet quickly decided that his involvement might actually be a bad omen. He had starred in Suicide Squad, Morbius, and Tron, all movies that got slammed by critics and bombed at the box office, ultimately damaging entire franchises. People started calling him the franchise destroyer, and that definitely felt like a bad sign for He-Man. Despite everything, Masters of the Universe was finally filmed and completed in 2025. For everyone involved, that was a massive step, but the real turning point came in January 2026, when Amazon dropped the first trailer. That's where we found out that as a kid, Prince Adam is sent to Earth to keep him safe from the threats of Eternia. He grows up among humans under the identity of Adam Glenn, but eventually goes back to his kingdom to become He-Man and fight Skeletor. The trailer definitely left an impression. A lot of people were hyped to see the most stunning recreation of Eternia to date, along with the appearance of beloved characters like Battle Cat. However, there was also a fair share of criticism. The tone felt a little too comedic. The origin story felt a lot like Superman's, and this new version of Skeletor raised some eyebrows, which seemed to confirm Leto's bad reputation. At this point in the video, we have to go back to our initial question. Why is it so hard to bring Masters of the Universe to the big screen? The answer lies in its very DNA. It started out as a Mattel toy line, and as their main marketing strategy, the company created the animated series. It didn't just help sell action figures, it became a massive hit that defined a generation and an absolute icon of the 80s. Kids all over the world were completely hooked by the mix of fantasy, sci-fi, colorful characters, and the little moral lesson delivered by the hero at the end of every episode. But what worked so perfectly in the animated series seems to actively work against any movie adaptations. The filmmakers, the studios, and even Mattel themselves just can't agree on the tone. If they try to make a movie that's too serious, they lose the over-the-top fun spirit of the original. If they aim it strictly at kids, older audiences might not take it seriously. And if they try to balance every single element, it can end up feeling generic and lacking identity, just like the 1987 movie. While Hollywood struggled to get a new movie off the ground, Masters of the Universe stayed relevant thanks to nostalgia and that retro factor, as well as a good amount of humor. In the age of the internet and social media, the animated series inspired tons of GIFs and memes, mostly replacing He-Man's wholesome life lessons with ironic commentary. Masters of the Universe is a core piece of pop culture, but it's never had a movie that actually did it justice. Instead of adventure and excitement, we got failed storylines, a scrapped sequel, and ambitious projects that just fizzled out. Now, under Amazon's wing, fans finally have a reason to get their hopes up. But it's probably best to stay cautious. This whole saga has taught us that nothing is guaranteed until we see the final product, and that Hollywood still owes a massive debt to He-Man, Castle Grayskull, and all of Eternia. Now we want to hear from you. Do you think this Masters of the Universe movie is finally going to break the curse, or is it going to be just another wasted opportunity? Let me know down in the comments. Scary Movie is doomed to fail. There was a time when Scary Movie was unstoppable. It made